Augustin Diro had spent 3 painstaking months cataloguing the city's slave registries when something stopped him cold. His hands trembled as he turned the brittle pages of a municipal ledger dated July 1842, recently retrieved from the courthouse archives. Carefully inscribed in neat, deliberate script were the birth records of 17 enslaved children. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. But then the pattern emerged. All 17 children had been born within a 3-month period. Each came from a different plantation, and every single entry carried the same disturbing notation: striking resemblance to a prominent citizen. No names were recorded, only that chilling description. As if that weren't enough, the page itself bore the marks of fire. Someone had tried to destroy it, scorching the paper just short of total ruin. Before we go further into what Augustin uncovered in those archives, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what secrets your own city might be hiding? Leave a comment telling us which state or city you're listening from. And if you're ready to uncover one of the darkest and most carefully buried scandals in American history, hit that subscribe button. What we're about to reveal will forever change how you see the antebellum South. Augustin Diro hadn't come to New Orleans looking for controversy. In the spring of 1891, the Massachusetts Historical Society dispatched him south with a straightforward assignment: preserve and document the city's administrative records before time erased them completely. At 43, Augustin had earned a reputation for patience, precision, and absolute discretion, at rates that made him the Society's trusted hand for sensitive historical work. He had unearthed uncomfortable truths before: long-hidden family scandals, forgotten debts, secret marriages buried by time. But nothing could have prepared him for what awaited in the basement archives of the New Orleans Civil District Court. The journey south took 6 days by train. Augustin remembered staring out the window as the world slowly transformed, at the rigid order of northeastern cities dissolving into vast farmland, then into something denser, untamed, and overgrown. By the time he arrived in Louisiana, even the air felt ultra heavy, sweet, and thick with decay. New Orleans had welcomed him with rain, warm torrents that flooded the streets and sent rats scurrying from the gutters. His boarding house on Dauphine Street smelled of mildew and Corey coffee, and the landlady, a widow named Mrs. Fontaine, had looked at him with dark knowing eyes when he mentioned his work at the courthouse. "You be careful what you dig up in that place," she'd said, her Creole accent softening the warning. "This city, she keeps secrets for a reason. Some things they meant to stay buried." Augustin had smiled politely, dismissing it as local superstition. He was a man of facts, of documentation and verification. Ghost stories and dark warnings had no place in historical research. The courthouse itself was a grand structure with columns that had once been white but had grayed with time and humidity. Inside, the halls echoed with footsteps, and the air hung heavy with the smell of old paper and wood rot. The current clerk, a thin man named Thibodeau, with yellowed teeth and a nervous habit of tapping his fingers against any available surface, had seemed almost relieved when Augustin requested access to the Antebellum slave records. "Nobody's looked at those in decades," Thibodeau had said, leading him down narrow stairs into a basement that smelled of mildew and something sweeter, more cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase. "Most folks prefer to forget. The city's moved on, you understand? What's the point of digging up old bones?" "Historical preservation," Augustin had replied. "These records tell us about commerce, about family structures, about the economic foundation of they tell us we were monsters." Thibodeau had interrupted, his voice flat. "That's what they tell us, but you go ahead and look. Just don't expect anyone to thank you for what you find." The basement archive was larger than Augustin had expected. Room after room of floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with ledgers, loose documents, rolled maps, and boxes of correspondence. Some sections were well organized, carefully labeled by year and type. Others were chaos: papers stuffed into crates, water-damaged volumes stacked haphazardly, folders bursting with documents that had been shoved in without regard for order. Augustin had started methodically, as he always did. He began with the standard documentation: bills of sale, transfer records, estate inventories. Slavery had been abolished for nearly 30 years, but its bureaucratic skeleton remained, carefully preserved in leather-bound volumes that detailed human beings as property, with the same clinical precision used for livestock and furniture. The first week he simply familiarized himself with the record-keeping systems. New Orleans had been under French rule, then Spanish, then French again before the Louisiana Purchase brought it into American hands. Each administrative change had left its mark on the documentation. Different languages, different formats, different levels of detail. By 1830, the records had standardized somewhat, adopting the American preference for exhaustive documentation. He had seen such records before in other southern cities, Charleston, Richmond, Savannah. What made New Orleans different was the sheer volume, the meticulous detail, and something else he couldn't quite identify at first. A sense of performance perhaps, as if the documents were meant not just to record transactions, but to communicate something else. Some subtext that he was missing. The notations began to stand out in the second week. Small marks in the margins, abbreviations that didn't match the standard legal shorthand of the period, FDR, appeared frequently, as did PA and BA. Some entries had small symbols drawn next to them, a star, a circle, a cross. Augustine made notes, thinking they might be clerk's marks, administrative codes for filing or categorization. But the pattern was wrong. The symbols appeared on specific types of transactions. Children listed without mothers. Mothers listed as deceased shortly after giving birth yet showing up alive on other plantations years later. Sale prices that made no economic sense. Some children valued at 5 times the normal rate. Others given away for $1 or marked as charitable transfer. One afternoon in his third week, Augustine found himself staring at a bill of sale for a 6-year-old boy named Benjamin transferred from the Riverside plantation to a buyer in Natchez, Mississippi. The price $1. The notation in the margin FDR urgent. Below in different handwriting, someone had added, family discretion required. That phrase appeared again and again as Augustine dug deeper. Family discretion required, private arrangement, benefactor anonymous. And then there were the physical descriptions unusually detailed for slave records of children. Light-skinned, angular features, gray eyes, prominent nose, auburn hair, tall for age, remarkable resemblance noted by assessor. Resemblance to whom? Augustine started cross-referencing the plantation names with ownership records, building a database of who owned which properties when. He made charts, drew connections, looked for patterns. Riverside Plantation belonged to the Beaumont family. Old money with ties to the state legislature. Cedar Hill was owned by Judge Harold Sinclair, who had served on the state Supreme Court for 15 years. Magnolia Terrace, Belle Grove, Oakmont, each one connected to names that appeared in the society pages, political appointments, commercial directories. It was Thibodeau who had brought him the burned ledger, though at first Augustine didn't realize what made it significant. The clerk had appeared at his desk one afternoon in late June, carrying a volume with charred edges wrapped in brown paper. His hands had been shaking slightly as he set it down. Found this stuck behind a cabinet during cleaning, he'd said, his voice carefully neutral. 4th floor in the old tax assessor's office. Thought you might want it for completeness. He'd started to leave, then paused at the door. Mr. Deo, if anyone asks what you're looking at down here, maybe don't mention everything. Some of the families, the old families, they still have influence and they don't like surprises. Augustine had nodded absently, already unwrapping the package. The ledger's cover was partially burned, the leather blackened and cracked. Someone had doused a fire before it could consume the entire volume, but the damage was significant. The first 20 pages were destroyed, reduced to brittle black fragments, but pages 2167 had survived, their edges brown, but their contents legible. The ledger covered births registered between April and June of 1842, a period that should have been routine. But as Augustine read through the entries, his trained eye caught the anomaly immediately. 17 children, all born to enslaved mothers on different plantations, scattered across Orleans Parish and the surrounding areas, all described with variations of the same phrase. Child bears notable resemblance features reminiscent of prominent person, striking similarity observed by registrar, and in each case where the father's name would typically be listed as unknown or left blank, someone had written a number, just a number between 1 and 8. The numbers were written in the same hand as the rest of the entry, suggesting they were part of the original registration, not added later. Augustine felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't a filing system or administrative code. This was something else, something deliberate. He pulled out a map of the parish and began marking the plantations. Belle Grove, 17 miles upriver; Magnolia Terrace, south near the Delta; Riverside, Cedar Hill, Oakmont, Clearwater, Ashland. Each one a substantial property, most of them owned by men whose names Augustine recognized from the society pages and political records he'd already reviewed. Senator Richard Valmont owned 3 of them. Judge Harold Sinclair owned 2. Congressman Thomas Beauchamp had inherited Riverside from his father. Marcus Delqua, who owned the largest banking house in the city, controlled Magnolia Terrace and 2 smaller properties. The names went on. A roster of the city's most powerful families. But these men weren't the connection. The numbered notations pointed somewhere else. Augustine spent the rest of that day and all of the next pulling every document he could find from early 1842, legislative records, court proceedings, newspaper archives, business registries. He was looking for men who had reason to visit multiple plantations, who moved in the highest circles, whose presence across different properties might explain why 17 children born in the same 3 months would all be noted for their resemblance to someone. As the courthouse clock struck 9 on his second evening of intensive searching, Augustine found the first match. Number 3 appeared in 7 of the birth records. He traced it back through property transactions, tax documents, and finally to a legislative report. Jonathan Cartwright, a state legislator who had served on the Committee on Agriculture and Labor. In January of 1842, Cartwright had personally led a health and welfare survey of slave quarters across Orleans Parish, part of a state mandate to assess living conditions and productivity. The survey had been conducted in January. The children marked with number 3 were all born in April and May. 9 months. Augustine's throat went dry. He pulled the legislative report and read through the list of plantations inspected. Belle Grove, Cedar Hill, Riverside, Oakmont, Clearwater, Magnolia Terrace, Ashland, every single property where a child marked with number 3 had been born. His hands were shaking as he checked the other numbers against legislative records, committee assignments, judicial circuits. Number 1 was Judge Harold Sinclair, who rode circuit to plantations across 3 parishes every February and March, conducting legal reviews of property deeds and business contracts. Number 2 was Senator Richard Valmont, who had chaired a commission on plantation productivity in late 1841 and early 1842. Number 5 was Thomas Beauchamp, then a young attorney who traveled frequently to negotiate labor contracts and settle estate matters. Each number corresponded to a man. Each man had documented reasons for visiting the plantations where children were born 9 months later. And each of those men was among the most respected, most powerful figures in Louisiana politics. 17 children, 8 men, all of them officials who should have been protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them. And someone had tried to burn the only record that connected them. Augustine locked the ledger in his document case that night and walked back to his boarding house through streets that suddenly felt hostile. Gas lamps cast wavering shadows that seemed to reach for him. The usual evening sounds, music from taverns, voices from open windows, the clatter of carriages, took on a sinister quality. Every footstep behind him might be someone following. Every figure in a doorway might be watching. He was being paranoid, he told himself. These events had happened 50 years ago. The men involved were old or dead. This was historical research, nothing more. But the burned ledger suggested otherwise. Someone had tried to destroy this evidence, and recently enough that the fire damage was still visible. the char still black rather than faded to grey, which meant someone still cared about keeping these secrets buried. Mrs. Fontaine was sitting in the parlour when he arrived, unusual for that hour. She looked up from her sewing as he entered. "You look pale, Mr. DeVoe. You finding things in that courthouse that trouble you?" "Just tired," he said. "Long day." She set down her sewing and fixed him with that knowing stare. "My mother worked in a big house on Esplanade Avenue. The master there, he was a judge, respected man, went to mass every Sunday, gave money to orphanages." She paused. "My mother said the quarters behind that house were full of children who had his eyes, his nose, his way of standing. Everyone knew, the mistress knew, the other servants knew, the neighbors knew, but nobody said a word. Not in public. Not where it could matter." "Why not?" Augustine asked, though he was beginning to understand. "Because saying it out loud, that would make it real. That would require action. Better to pretend not to see, to look away, to let it be someone else's problem." She picked up her sewing again. "This city's built on things people chose not to see. Mr. DeVoe, you go pulling back that curtain. You best be prepared for what you find underneath." Augustine didn't sleep well at night. He kept thinking about the numbers, about the careful code that let people document crimes while maintaining deniability. If anyone questioned the entries, they were just administrative marks. But to someone who knew who had the key, they told the whole story. Who had created this system? Who had decided that these births needed to be recorded but encrypted, and most importantly, who else knew how to read it? The next morning he returned to the archives with new urgency. If this pattern existed in 1842, it might exist in other years. He began pulling birth registers from the entire decade, then expanded to the 1830s, then to estate records, sale documents, anything that might show more of the picture. What he found made the 1842 entries look like a single thread in a vast dark tapestry. The pattern went back decades, not every year, but regularly enough that it couldn't be coincidence. Clusters of children born in specific seasons marked with those same cryptic notations, their physical descriptions unusually detailed for slave records. These weren't standard administrative descriptions. They were portraits carefully worded to communicate something specific to anyone who knew how to read them. In 1838, there were 12 children marked with numbers between 1 and 5. Augustine traced number 2 that year to a state senator named William Foster, who had toured plantations as part of an agricultural development initiative. All the children marked with his number were born 9 months after his tour. In 1840, 19 children spread across 2 parishes marked with numbers 1 through 7. Number 4 belonged to a wealthy merchant named Charles Beauregard, who bought and sold plantation supplies and visited dozens of properties each year. In 1845, 11 children, numbers 1 through 4. In 1847, 15 children, numbers 1 through 6. Year after year, the pattern repeated. Clusters of births following visits by powerful men, all carefully documented with a code that preserved the evidence while protecting the guilty. Augustine began calculating. If there were roughly 15 marked children per year, and the pattern extended from at least 1838 to 1852, the last year before the record-keeping system changed, that meant over 200 children, and those were just the ones whose records had survived, the ones where the connection was clear enough to document. How many others had there been? How many children born without being marked or marked in ways he didn't recognize? How many records had been destroyed before he got there? The scope of it was staggering. This wasn't a few isolated incidents. This was systematic, organized, protected by a bureaucracy that had created an entire coding system to track it while maintaining plausible deniability. Augustine found himself working with a new intensity, barely sleeping, eating meals at his desk. Tiber brought him documents without being asked now, appearing silently and leaving brown-wrapped packages that always contained exactly what Augustine needed next. The clerk never explained how he knew what to bring, and Augustine never asked. There was an understanding between them, a shared recognition that this work mattered, that someone needed to bear witness. One afternoon in July, Thibodeau lingered after delivering a packet of papers. The archive was empty except for the two of them, and the clerk's usual nervous energy had settled into something quieter, more serious. "My grandmother worked at Magnolia Terrace," he said, his eyes fixed on the wall behind Augustine. "She was brought there as a girl, maybe 13 years old, worked in the house, helping with cooking and cleaning. She told me once that the house girls knew when the inspections were coming. They knew to disappear into the fields, to suddenly take sick, to do anything to avoid being seen." He paused, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm against his leg. "The ones who couldn't hide or who were chosen anyway." He stopped, swallowed. "My grandmother said they learned to go quiet inside themselves, to be somewhere else in their minds while it happened. And afterward, if there were consequences, if a child came," another pause, "the mistress of the house, she would arrange for the woman to be sold away, always phrased as punishment for some invented infraction. But everyone knew the real reason. Can't have evidence walking around. Can't have children who look like ghosts of the master's legitimate family." "Ghosts?" Augustine asked. "That's what they called them. The ghost children. Because you couldn't talk about them, couldn't acknowledge what was right in front of your eyes. They were there and not there at the same time, visible but invisible." Thibodeau finally looked at Augustine. "She said the newspapers never wrote about it. Said there was an understanding between the papers and the families. The editors, the politicians, the big planters, they were all the same people." "You understand? You didn't write about your own understanding," Augustine repeated, thinking about the silence he'd found in the newspaper archives. "Everyone benefited from the silence," Thibodeau continued. "The politicians kept their reputations. The newspapers kept their advertisers and their social standing. The white women of the households could pretend their husbands were faithful. And the men," his voice turned bitter, "the men got to do whatever they wanted without consequence." After Thibodeau left, Augustine sat in the silent archive and thought about all the historical records he'd ever studied, all the documents he'd carefully catalogued and preserved. How much of history was what people chose to write down, and how much was determined by what they chose to ignore? How many crimes had been committed in plain sight, documented in coded language, hidden behind bureaucratic systems that made them invisible? He began searching newspaper archives next, hoping to find some reference, some oblique mention that might corroborate what he was finding in the birth records. The Times, Picayune, the Daily Crescent, the True Delta, the Commercial Bulletin. New Orleans had been a city of newspapers, competing publications that covered everything from shipping news to society gossip. Augustine read through society pages, birth announcements, political coverage, crime reports. The silence was absolute. In a city whose newspapers documented every society wedding, every political appointment, every minor scandal involving merchants or shopkeepers, there was not a single mention of enslaved children resembling their owners or their owners' associates. Not one letter to the editor questioning the presence of light-skinned children on plantations. Not one editorial about the moral implications. Not even the coded euphemistic language that Victorian society often used to discuss uncomfortable topics. It was as if an entire category of reality had been agreed upon as non-existent. But there were other patterns in the news. Patterns that only became visible when you knew what to look for. Stories that appeared then vanished. He found a 2-paragraph piece from May 1843 about a disturbance at a plantation in St. Charles Parish where enslaved workers had refused to labor and made unseemly accusations against parties of quality. The story ran once on page 7, then was never mentioned again. Unusual for a paper that typically followed up on labor disputes, property damage, and any threat to the social order. When Augustine searched the court records, he found no trial, no resolution, no further documentation. The incident had simply stopped existing in the official record. He found similar ghost stories scattered across the decade. Brief mentions of irregular claims withdrawn before reaching court, of unsubstantiated charges dismissed by magistrates, of workers removed to distant properties for disciplinary purposes, with no explanation of what discipline was required. Each story appeared once and disappeared, leaving no trace except that single mention easily overlooked, easily forgotten. Someone had been systematically silencing these stories. But the question that haunted Augustine as he worked deeper into the summer was, why keep the birth ledgers at all? If the newspapers could be controlled, if court records could vanish, if entire incidents could be erased from public memory, why maintain these detailed registries that documented exactly what they wanted hidden? The answer came from an unexpected source. In mid-August, on a day so hot and humid that the archive felt like a steam bath, a young man appeared at the courthouse, asking for Augustine by name. He was well dressed in a way that spoke of careful economy, good quality clothes that had been maintained meticulously rather than replaced when fashions changed. His skin was light brown, his features sharp and distinctive. He carried himself with quiet confidence, despite the fact that his presence in the courthouse drew stares from clerks and visitors. He handed Augustine a card that read, "Jacob Le, Private Inquiry Agent." "Mr. DeVoe," Le said, his voice cultured, his English carrying just a trace of French inflection. "I believe we have mutual interests." They met that evening at a cafe far from the courthouse in the TMA neighborhood where a mixed-race man and a white researcher could talk without drawing unwanted attention. The cafe was small, dim with tables tucked into corners that offered privacy. Le had chosen a spot in the back away from windows. He had brought his own documents, letters, photographs, carefully compiled genealogies written in a precise hand. The papers were organized in folders, each labeled with a year and a name. "Mr. DeVoe," Lec began, "I need to know whether I can trust you, whether what you're doing in that courthouse is genuine historical research or something else." "Genuine?" Augustine said. "The Massachusetts Historical Society sent me to document." "I know why they sent you. What I need to know is what you plan to do with what you're finding." Leaves' eyes were intense, searching. "Because if you're just collecting scandal for some academic journal, sensational stories that will be read and forgotten, then I'm wasting both our time." Augustine thought about the burned ledger, about Thibodeau's warnings, about the pattern of silence he'd uncovered. "I don't know yet what I'm going to do," he admitted, "but I know that what I found needs to be preserved. These records document crimes, systematic crimes committed by people in positions of power. That matters. It should matter." Le studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "My mother was born at Cedar Hill Plantation in June of 1844. She was noted in the registry as bearing remarkable resemblance to benefactor. The number beside her entry was 6. Number 6. Augustine had traced that number to Marcus Diqua, the banker who controlled half the commercial lending in New Orleans. "When I was young," Levesque continued, "my mother told me about the ghost children. She said there were dozens of us, maybe hundreds, scattered across Louisiana and the territories where people had been sold. Children who looked like senators and judges, like the men who wrote laws saying we were property. She said our existence was the truth. They couldn't afford to let anyone speak." He laid out photographs on the table. Men and women, children and adults, spanning different decades. Some of the photographs were formal studio portraits, expensive and carefully composed. Others were simpler, taken with hand cameras showing people in everyday settings. "I've been finding them," Le said. "The ones who survived, the ones who stayed in Louisiana, the descendants. We all have the records, the birth ledgers, the sale documents with our faces described in detail. Some of us were sold away immediately to distant plantations where we wouldn't be seen by the wrong people. Others were kept close, sometimes in the same households as our father's legitimate children, invisible in plain sight." His voice was steady, professional, but Augustine could see the tension in his hands as he arranged the photographs. "My mother was raised at Cedar Hill until she was 8 years old. Then she was sold to a family in Baton Rouge. No explanation, no warning. One day she was there. The next day she was on a boat heading upriver. She didn't understand why until she was older, until she realized she looked too much like someone important, someone whose wife might start asking questions." Augustine looked at the photographs. The people in them bore the features La had described. Light-skinned European features, expressions that seemed to carry a weight of knowledge of secrets held close. "Why are you telling me this?" Augustine asked. "What do you want from me?" "Proof," La said simply. "I have family stories. I have photographs. I have memories. But I don't have official documentation. The birth records, the sales, the coded numbers, those are legal documents. They can't be dismissed as fabrication or false memory. If you can prove the pattern, if you can show the system, then maybe." He stopped, gathered himself. "Maybe it will mean something. Maybe someone will have to acknowledge what happened. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the conspiracy deepens." If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Over the following weeks, Augustine and Elsie worked together, combining the official records with the human stories behind them. La brought people to meet Augustine, elderly men and women who had been born into slavery, younger people who carried the legacy in their features and their family histories. There was Marie Toussaint, a seamstress in her 50s who had been born at Belle Grove Plantation in 1839. Her mother had been sold to Cuba when Marie was 3 months old. Marie had been raised by her grandmother who told her stories about her mother, how she had been quiet and gentle, how she sang while she worked, how she disappeared one day and never came back. "My grandmother said, my mother was chosen because she was pretty," Marie told Augustine, her voice matter-of-fact, but her eyes distorted. When the inspectors came through, the pretty girls were the ones who caught attention. "My grandmother tried to keep my mother hidden, made her work in the laundry where it was hot and steamy and no one looked too close. But someone saw her, and 9 months later, there I was." She showed Augustine a small leather folder containing 2 items, a photograph of herself as a young woman and a newspaper clipping of State Senator Thomas Beauchamp at his daughter's wedding in 1870. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same high forehead, the same set of the eyes, the same slight asymmetry to the mouth. "I saw him once," Marie said. "I was working as a maid in a hotel on Canal Street and he came in for some political